My name is Carol. I am 35 years old. Last November, I sat at my parents' dining table in Machias, Maine, listening to the wind rattle the window panes off the Atlantic. My younger brother Kevin sat across from me, holding court about his eldest son's travel hockey tournament. When I quietly asked him to pass the butter, Kevin stopped talking. He looked at my worn flannel shirt. He offered a tight, condescending smirk. "You would not understand busy family schedules." "Carol," he said, "where are your husband and kids?" "Oh, right. You do not have any." My father chuckled, a low rattle in his chest. My mother raised a cloth napkin to her mouth to hide her grin. A heavy, suffocating quiet settled over the room. I did not scream. I did not cry. I set my fork down next to my plate of baked haddock. I looked straight into my brother's smug expression. "Where is your money?" "Kevin," I asked. "Oh, right. I have been supporting you. Until today." The laughter died in an instant. The tension in the room thickened into concrete. I stood up, grabbed my wool coat from the back of the chair, and walked out into the freezing coastal night without another word. That was the evening my entire family fractured. Before I bring you back into that dining room, take a second to like this video, subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories, and drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from right now. To understand the cruelty of their laughter, you have to understand what my daily life looks like. I have worked as a waitress at a Route 1 diner since I was 19 years old. My life consists of early morning shifts, pouring black coffee for fishermen, aching arches, and solitary routines. I live in a cramped apartment above a hardware store on Main Street. I keep my thermostat set to 60 degrees in the dead of winter to save cash. I live this frugal, quiet life because, for the past 4 years, I have been quietly paying my parents' property taxes and their winter heating oil bills. Thomas and Martha claimed their retirement savings were drained by medical debts. They painted a picture of two vulnerable seniors struggling to survive the harsh New England winters. I believed them. I handed over envelopes of my hard-earned cash to keep a roof over their heads. I sacrificed my own comfort, skipping vacations and ignoring my own savings account, to ensure they stayed warm. But sitting in the cold front seat of my rusted sedan that Sunday night, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, the math finally clicked into place. Kevin is a lobsterman. In our part of the state, that profession carries a specific, rugged prestige. Yet, while I was handing our parents $2,000 to cover emergency roof repairs, Kevin had somehow managed to purchase a brand new, heavy-duty Ford diesel truck. He flaunted it in the driveway that very evening, bragging about the heated leather seats. The betrayal formed a cold, heavy knot in my stomach. My parents were not drowning in medical debt. They were systematically funneling my waitress tips to subsidize my brother's failing commercial fishing business. They drained my meager livelihood to protect their golden son, the man who gave them grandchildren while I poured coffee for strangers. And then, they sat at a dinner table and laughed at my empty house. They thought I would stay quiet. They thought wrong. I drove away from my parents' coastal property with the heater in my sedan blasting at full capacity. The rusted vents blew lukewarm air against my frozen knuckles. The coastal highway winding through Machias offered no comfort. Just a dark stretch of asphalt bordered by towering pines and the relentless churning of the Atlantic Ocean. I parked behind the hardware store on Main Street, killed the engine, and sat in the dark for a long time. My feet throbbed. Decades of balancing heavy ceramic plates and dodging swinging kitchen doors leave a permanent ache in your arches. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs to my apartment, unlocking the deadbolt with numb fingers. The space inside felt like an icebox. I walked past the thermostat, leaving the dial firmly at 60 degrees, and wrapped a thick wool blanket over my shoulders. My parents lived in a sprawling, drafty farmhouse perched on a rocky bluff. It was the kind of property that looked picturesque on a postcard but cost a fortune to maintain. The wind tore off the ocean, stripping the paint and seeping through the single-pane windows. 4 years ago, my father Thomas sat me down in their living room. He held a stack of past-due medical invoices in his lap. He claimed his heart condition and the resulting surgeries had devoured their entire retirement portfolio. He stared at the floor, rubbing his temples, playing the role of a proud Maine patriarch brought low by a failing body. My mother, Martha, wept softly in the corner, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She told me the county was threatening to seize the property over unpaid property taxes. She painted a vivid, terrifying picture of two vulnerable seniors being thrown out into the snow. I believed every single syllable. I am the unmarried daughter, the one who stayed behind while my high school classmates moved to Boston or Portland. I assumed the burden of care. I began handing them thick envelopes of cash. I took on double shifts at the diner, working breakfast and dinner rushes, smelling perpetually of fryer oil, bleached countertops, and stale coffee. I hoarded my tips. I saved every crumpled $1 bill, every $5, every quarter. I ignored the strange rattling noise in my car engine. I skipped my dental checkups. I bought my clothes off clearance racks and ate leftover clam chowder from the restaurant kitchen to keep my grocery bills low. I funneled all my spare income directly into their bank accounts. I paid the exorbitant winter heating oil delivery fees so they would not freeze. I covered the property taxes so they would not lose the ancestral home. Sitting at my small Formica kitchen table that Sunday night, the memory of their laughter ringing in my ears, I needed to see the truth in black and white. I pulled a cardboard shoebox down from the top shelf of my closet. It held 4 years of bank statements, ATM receipts, and tax records. I spread the papers across the table, the harsh overhead light casting long shadows over the numbers. I grabbed a yellow highlighter and a calculator. I started tracing the exact timeline of my withdrawals. I highlighted every time I drained my savings to rescue Thomas and Martha. Then, I cross-referenced those dates with the major events in my brother's life. In our region of New England, lobstermen hold a mythical status. They are treated like local royalty, symbols of rugged independence and hard work. Kevin inherited my father's wooden boat and the family fishing license. But the Atlantic waters are changing. The yields are shrinking. And federal regulations make independent fishing an incredibly precarious living. Kevin was constantly complaining about the rising cost of diesel and the poor catches. Yet, his lifestyle never reflected a struggling fisherman. Kevin strutted through town like a king, wearing designer sunglasses and expensive waterproof gear, while I taped the soles of my work shoes together to make them last another season. I stared at a specific bank statement from early October, 3 weeks prior to the dinner. Martha had called me in a frantic state. She claimed a brutal autumn storm had torn the shingles off their roof. She said the water was leaking directly into their bedroom, and they needed $2,000 immediately to pay a local contractor. I emptied my emergency fund. I drove to the local bank branch, withdrew the cash in crisp $100 bills, and handed the envelope directly to my father. Now, I looked at the calendar. 4 days after I handed my parents that envelope, Kevin rolled up to the diner in a brand new, heavy-duty Ford diesel truck. It had heated leather seats, a pristine chrome grille, and off-road tires that had never touched mud. He bragged to the waitstaff that he put down a substantial cash deposit to secure the financing. The terrible arithmetic clicked into place. The dates aligned perfectly. The emergency roof repair was a phantom crisis. There was no leak. There was no contractor. My parents were not drowning in medical debt. They were running a quiet, domestic money laundering operation. They were extracting my hard-earned waitress tips, utilizing my empathy as leverage, and funneling that cash directly to my brother. They were subsidizing Kevin's failing commercial fishing business to keep up his facade of success. He needed to look like the prosperous captain, and my parents decided I was going to foot the bill. They drained my meager livelihood to protect the golden son, the man who provided them with the grandchildren they valued above all else. I sat alone in the freezing apartment, staring at the yellow highlighter marks on my bank statements. I ran my fingers over the edge of the printed paper, feeling it bend under my grip. The silence of the apartment felt different now. It was no longer a sanctuary of frugal independence. It felt like a trap I had willingly walked into. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. It was a profound, suffocating betrayal. They had traded my security, my youth, and my comfort to finance a lie. I had spent half a decade pouring coffee and rubbing my aching joints to buy a truck for a man who mocked me for being alone. They laughed at my empty house, ignorant of the fact that they were the reason I could never afford to build a life of my own. My chest tightened as the depth of their manipulation settled into my bones. I needed to understand exactly what kind of financial ruin my brother was hiding beneath his expensive new truck. The cold knot in my stomach did not instantly turn to unyielding hatred. I am a pragmatic woman. I pour black coffee for fishermen every morning, navigating the narrow aisles between vinyl booths, listening to their hushed, frantic conversations. I hear the anxious murmurs about restrictive trap limits, the skyrocketing cost of diesel fuel, and the looming threat of offshore wind farms. I overhear the harbor gossip before it ever reaches the local newspaper. Because of this daily exposure to the grim reality of our local economy, I know my brother is not a two-dimensional villain who wakes up every morning plotting ways to inflict pain. Kevin is a drowning man, thrashing wildly in the dark, terrified of losing his entire identity. In Washington County, Maine, hauling lobster traps is not just a job you do to pay the utility bills. It is a bloodline. It is a sacred, generational legacy passed from calloused hand to calloused hand. A man's worth in Machias is often measured by the length of his boat, the size of his daily catch, and the rugged stoicism he projects while enduring the freezing Atlantic spray. But the ocean is changing. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than almost any other body of water on the planet. The lobsters are migrating further offshore, seeking colder depths. The yields drop lower every season. While the federal fishing regulations tighten like a noose, independent operators are suffocating under layers of expensive gear mandates, restricted fishing zones, and mounting commercial debt. Kevin inherited my father's old wooden boat, a beautiful but horribly inefficient vessel named the Martha Jane, along with a mountain of unspoken expectations. Thomas expected his son to conquer the ocean the exact same way he did in the 1980s. Back when the water was freezing, diesel was cheap, and the catches were endless. Kevin carried the crushing weight of that legacy every time he stepped off the wooden docks. He possessed a wife, Sarah, and 3 growing boys who played expensive travel hockey and wore premium brand-name winter gear. He built a domestic lifestyle based on a local economic boom that simply no longer existed. I know the grim reality of his desperation because small towns leak secrets, and bank tellers eat breakfast at my diner. 3 weeks before our explosive Sunday dinner, his polished facade finally cracked. Kevin sat alone in his leased bait shed on the edge of the harbor. The air inside that dilapidated wooden shack reeked of rotting herring, damp rope, and heavy petroleum. The relentless Maine wind howled through the gaps in the siding, biting at his exposed skin. He sat on an overturned plastic bucket, staring at a piece of heavy bond paper illuminated by a single, swinging bare bulb. It was a formal foreclosure notice from the local credit union regarding his commercial boat slip. Without a slip, a captain cannot dock his boat. Without a boat, a captain cannot fish. Without fishing, Kevin ceases to be a lobsterman, stripping away the only identity he has ever known. Sitting in the foul-smelling dark, crushed by the shame of failing his family, my brother broke down. He dropped the bank notice onto the damp floorboards and wept into his cracked, freezing hands. The rugged, unbreakable New England captain cried alone in the damp shack, terrified of looking his wife in the eye and admitting he was entirely broke. That moment of vulnerability explains his actions, but it does not excuse them. Desperation twists a person's moral compass, warping their sense of entitlement. Kevin genuinely believed that because he continued the family trade, because he provided male heirs to carry on the family name, The family owed him a financial life raft. He viewed my parents' retirement savings as his birthright, an emergency fund reserved exclusively for the golden son. When those savings ran dry, he turned his gaze toward me. I was just the unmarried sister serving eggs to tourists on Route 1. I had no children to feed. I had no legacy to protect. In his mind, my money was disposable. While his pride was essential, he saw my solitary life as a blank slate, devoid of meaning because I lacked a husband and children. Society often expects the unmarried daughter to quietly absorb the burdens of the aging family, sacrificing her own future to prop up the siblings who chose traditional paths. Kevin and my parents leaned heavily into this unspoken rule. They assumed I would never notice the missing funds because they assumed my world was small enough to fit inside a diner and a tiny apartment. He was not stealing to buy luxury yachts or take extravagant tropical vacations. He was stealing to preserve a rugged, masculine illusion that was slipping through his fingers like seawater. He needed a brand new diesel truck to project financial stability to the other captains at the harbor cooperative. He needed my hard-earned cash to plug the gaping holes in his sinking commercial operation. My parents, blinded by their adoration for their grandsons and their desperate need to maintain social standing in our tight-knit community, gladly facilitated the theft. They willingly became his accomplices, laundering my waitress tips under the guise of fake medical debts and fictitious roof leaks to spare Kevin the humiliation of bankruptcy. Understanding his motive did not extinguish my anger. It sharpened it into a precise, calculated edge. I packed the bank statements and tax records back into the cardboard shoebox and shoved it deep onto the top shelf of my closet. I finally reached out and turned the dial on my thermostat up to 70 degrees, letting the mechanical warmth flood my cramped apartment for the first time in years. I listened to the old radiator hiss and clank, promising myself I would never endure another shivering night to finance my brother's pride. The era of my quiet sacrifice was officially over. I worked my shifts at the diner for the next 3 days in silence, pouring coffee and wiping down vinyl booths, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. When you expose a deep family secret, the guilty parties do not apologize or seek redemption. They double down. They scramble to regain control of the narrative and secure the cash flow you just cut off. The first major obstacle arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, dragging our quiet domestic battle out of the shadows and directly into the harsh, uncompromising light of the legal system. My phone buzzed in my apron pocket near the end of the lunch rush. It was my father. He spoke with a strained, artificial politeness, demanding I come to the farmhouse immediately after my shift to discuss a pressing family legal matter. He acted as if the confrontation at the Sunday dinner had never occurred. I clocked out, traded my stained apron for my heavy wool coat, and drove back down the winding coastal highway. The ocean looked slate gray and violent under the heavy winter clouds, the waves crashing relentlessly against the rocky shoreline. The familiar route felt entirely different today, tainted by the knowledge of what lived inside that house. I parked my rusted sedan next to Kevin's pristine Ford diesel truck in the gravel driveway. I walked through the front door of the drafty house, bracing myself to defend my bank account and draw a firm line in the sand. Instead, I found a thick, imposing legal binder resting on the center of the coffee table, a document that possessed the power to permanently strip away my only remaining inheritance. The coastal wind hammered against the front of the farmhouse as I pushed the heavy oak door open. I stepped into the foyer and wiped my wet boots on the bristled mat. The air inside smelled of burning birchwood, old damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of brewing coffee. I walked into the living room, keeping my heavy coat buttoned tight against my chin. My father Thomas sat in his worn leather recliner near the cast-iron wood stove. My mother Martha perched on the edge of the floral sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Kevin stood near the stone fireplace, leaning his shoulder against the wooden mantel, staring into the flickering flames. Resting in the exact center of the polished oak coffee table was a thick black legal binder. They greeted me with an eerie, orchestrated normalcy, Martha offered me a cup of hot tea, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Thomas commented on the dropping barometric pressure and the severe winter storm blowing in off the dark Atlantic waters. It was a bizarre, choreographed performance designed to pretend the Sunday dinner blowout had never occurred. They operated under the assumption that if they ignored my rebellion, it would simply fade away like a passing storm. I declined the tea. I remained standing near the entryway, my hands thrust deep into my coat pockets, waiting for the polite charade to drop. Thomas eventually leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He cleared his throat and adopted his deep, authoritative patriarch tone. He pointed a weathered finger at the black binder resting on the table. He began to discuss the legal arrangement we finalized 3 years ago in a pristine office building in Bangor. In the state of Maine, residential nursing home care can cost upwards of $10,000 a month. The state possesses the legal authority to recover those exorbitant costs by seizing a patient's estate after they pass away. 3 years ago, terrified of losing this ancestral coastal property to government estate recovery, my parents hired a specialized elder law attorney. They executed an irrevocable Medicaid asset protection trust. They transferred the deed of the farmhouse into this trust, formally relinquishing their direct ownership to shield the property from future medical claims. Once the mandatory 5-year look-back period expired, the state could not touch the house, because Kevin was already drowning in commercial fishing debt and possessed a messy financial history involving unpaid bait suppliers and maxed-out credit cards. The attorney strongly advised against making him the sole heir. Creditors could easily place a lien on his portion of the inheritance. Therefore, I was named as a primary remainder beneficiary. This meant that upon my parents' passing, the property would legally transfer to me. It was the unspoken reward for my quiet servitude. It was the singular asset that was supposed to secure my own fragile future after I spent my prime earning years paying their utility bills and ignoring my own retirement savings. Thomas tapped the rigid cover of the binder. He explained that family circumstances had shifted. He introduced a legal term I had never heard before: decanting. He spoke the word with rehearsed precision, making it sound like a routine, surgical adjustment rather than a drastic financial gamble. He explained they needed to decant the trust immediately. Decanting is a highly complex legal maneuver used to pour the assets of an existing, irrevocable trust into a brand new trust, featuring entirely different terms. It is essentially a loophole designed to alter a contract that is legally meant to be unalterable. Thomas wanted to dissolve the current protective structure, borrow against the equity of the farmhouse, and extract $80,000 in liquid cash. He did not attempt to hide the destination of the money. Kevin needed a bailout. The commercial boat loan on the family vessel was dragging him under the water. The new diesel truck parked in the gravel driveway had depleted whatever remaining cash reserves he possessed. The local credit union was threatening to seize his boat and revoke his slip at the Harbor Cooperative. The $80,000 would clear his immediate commercial arrears, satisfy his angry creditors, and secure his fishing license for another season. My parents were willing to risk their own home, breaking the Medicaid shield and leaving themselves vulnerable to the state, just to save his fragile pride. But there was a significant legal catch hidden within their desperate plan. Because the original trust was irrevocable, Maine state property law dictated that the grantors could not change the terms unilaterally. They needed the formal, notarized consent of all listed beneficiaries. They needed my signature. Thomas opened the binder and extracted a dense stack of papers printed on heavy bond paper. He slid the documents across the oak coffee table. He placed a silver ballpoint pen directly on top of the signature line. He looked at me with a mild, expectant expression. Martha offered a tight, nervous pulling of her lips, a silent plea for compliance. Kevin stared at the braided rug, pretending he was not the reason we were all gathered in this room, waiting for his sister to rescue him again. They expected the dutiful waitress to obey. They expected the 35-year-old spinster who wore taped work shoes and bought discount groceries to simply sign away her only financial safety net. They assumed my conditioning was so deep, my habit of rescuing them so ingrained into my personality, that I would surrender my future inheritance without a single argument just to maintain the peace. They believed my loyalty to the family hierarchy would override my own basic instinct for survival. I looked down at the legal document. The stark black ink spelled out the total surrender of my rights. I realized the profound power resting in my frozen hands. The entire rescue operation hinged on my compliance. For the first time in my entire life, my signature was the only barrier standing between my brother and a substantial unearned payout. I held the keys to his commercial survival, and he knew it. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not sit down on the floral sofa to discuss the terms of my surrender. I looked at Thomas, then at Martha, and finally at Kevin. "I will not do it," I said. I spoke the words quietly, but they carried the weight of a heavy stone dropping onto a glass table. I stated that I would not sign the waiver. I would not authorize the extraction of equity to pay for a boat loan that should have been managed responsibly years ago. I would not let them bankrupt my future to fund his illusion. Thomas blinked, his face contorting in genuine confusion, as if I had just spoken a foreign language. He asked me to repeat myself, his voice faltering, unable to process the refusal. I stepped forward, reached out with my index finger, and pushed the silver pen away. It rolled across the polished wood and clattered onto the floor. I told him I was done financing this charade. I told him my days of subsidizing Kevin were over. The polite illusion of family unity shattered into jagged pieces. The mild expressions vanished, replaced by an intense, terrifying hostility. Thomas gripped the padded armrests of his recliner, his knuckles turning stark white. His face reddened with sudden fury. He raised his voice, demanding respect, reminding me that this was his house and his equity. He shouted that I was an ungrateful child trying to ruin my own brother over a petty grudge. Martha leaped to her feet. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. Her voice grew shrill, echoing off the stone fireplace. She accused me of harboring deep resentment. She claimed I was a bitter woman trying to destroy her son out of pure jealousy because I had no family of my own. Kevin stepped away from the mantel. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, using his broad shoulders and significant height to intimidate me. The smell of diesel fuel and stale beer radiated off his heavy canvas jacket. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. He called me a selfish parasite. He told me I had no right to hold the family hostage over a piece of paper. I stood my ground. I looked up at my brother, feeling the icy draft leaking through the window panes brush against my neck. I reminded him that the credit union was holding him hostage, not me. I turned around, grasped the brass handle of the front door, and walked back out into the freezing coastal wind. The shouting followed me down the driveway, a chaotic chorus of blame and desperation, setting the stage for a much darker kind of warfare. I drove away from the farmhouse with the sound of my father shouting, fading into the roar of the ocean wind. The heater in my rusted sedan struggled to cut through the chill gripping my chest. I thought the worst part of the ordeal was over. I assumed drawing a firm boundary would result in a prolonged, icy silence. I underestimated the sheer desperation of people accustomed to spending someone else's money. The retaliation did not take weeks to materialize. It arrived the very next morning, and the strike was brutally targeted. Kevin knew he could not intimidate me physically. My brother understood that yelling in a gravel driveway would not produce a signature on a legal document. So he enlisted a different kind of warfare, orchestrated entirely by his wife. Sarah was a woman who treated her local social status like a fragile glass sculpture. She spent her days managing travel hockey schedules, driving a spotless sport utility vehicle, and curating an image of upper-middle-class perfection on social media. She operated under the strict belief that the rest of the world existed solely to facilitate her comfort. When Kevin returned home that Thursday evening and confessed that the financial pipeline was permanently closed, Sarah recognized the imminent threat to her lifestyle. She did not reflect on their mounting debts or suggest downsizing their budget. Instead, she leveraged the only currency she possessed. She turned her children into weapons. My parents defined their entire existence through their 3 grandsons. For Thomas and Martha, those boys were tangible proof of a successful, thriving legacy. The grandparents attended every single regional hockey tournament, treating the freezing ice rinks as their personal social clubs. They bragged to the other coastal families about the boys' report cards and goal statistics, using the children as a shield against their own creeping irrelevance. Sarah understood this dynamic perfectly. She knew exactly where to slide the knife to inflict maximum panic. Before the diner opened for the breakfast rush on Friday, Sarah sent a long, vicious text message directly to my mother. She did not contact me. She bypassed the roadblock and went straight for the weakest link in the chain. The message laid out a ruthless ultimatum. Sarah declared that because I was tearing the family apart with my selfish refusal to sign the trust waiver, the environment was too toxic for her children, until the grandparents forced me to sign the decanting paperwork. Thomas and Martha were officially banned from seeing the boys. The text listed the upcoming events with surgical cruelty. There would be no Thanksgiving dinner at the farmhouse. There would be no attending the Winter Hockey Invitationals in Portland. There would be no gathering around the tree on Christmas morning. Sarah effectively held the grandchildren hostage, demanding an $80,000 ransom paid in the form of my surrendered inheritance. The ultimatum sent my parents spiraling into a blind panic. They did not direct their anger at the woman utilizing her own sons as bargaining chips. They directed the entirety of their terror and rage at me. By mid-morning, my cell phone began vibrating endlessly in my apron pocket. I was carrying a tray of heavy ceramic mugs to a corner booth when the first voicemail registered. I stepped into the cramped employee break room, wiping spilled coffee off my hands with a rag, and pressed the device to my ear. Martha sounded unrecognizable. Her voice was not the polite, measured tone she used at church. It was a frantic, shrill torrent of blame. She wept into the receiver, gasping for air, recounting Sarah's text message word for word. Then the grief morphed into a venomous attack. My mother called me a bitter, ungrateful spinster. She accused me of trying to destroy their joy out of sheer jealousy. She claimed that because I had failed to secure a husband or build a family of my own, I was determined to sabotage Kevin's happiness. She demanded I drive straight to the elder law attorney in Bangor and sign the papers immediately. She ordered me to fix the mess I had created and restore their access to the grandkids. The messages kept coming. Every hour, another notification chimed. Thomas left a message next, his tone dark and authoritative, threatening to cut ties with me if I did not correct my disobedience. The digital barrage was relentless. They sought to grind my resolve down through sheer repetition, betting that I would eventually fold under the weight of their collective disapproval. The isolation felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. It was a suffocating pressure that made drawing a full breath difficult. I walked back out onto the diner floor, grabbing a fresh pot of dark roast, and forced my face into a neutral's pleasant mask. I poured coffee for local contractors, discussing lumber prices. I served stacks of blueberry pancakes to passing tourists. I smiled at strangers and asked about their travels, all while carrying the devastating knowledge that the people who shared my blood despised me. I was entirely cut off from the only family I had ever known, vilified and discarded simply because I refused to fund a predatory lie. Have you ever been punished by your own family for refusing to set yourself on fire just to keep them warm? It is a unique, agonizing type of loneliness. It seeps into your bones, colder than the coastal wind howling outside the restaurant windows. When the people you spent your entire adult life protecting suddenly turn you into the villain. The cognitive dissonance is blinding. You lie awake in a freezing apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the voicemails in the dark. You wonder if you are the monster they claim you are. You second-guess your own sanity. You ask yourself if holding onto a piece of paper is truly worth the total destruction of your family tree. You start to rationalize the surrender, thinking it might just be easier to sign the document and buy back the illusion of peace. But illusions are expensive, and I was out of currency. I thought about the rusted frame of my sedan. I thought about the 4 years of skipped dental appointments, the clearance rack coats, and the thermostat locked at 60 degrees. I thought about the yellow highlighter marks on my bank statements, tracking the thousands of dollars I had poured into Kevin's brand new heated leather seats. They did not want a daughter or a sister. They wanted a blank checkbook. The guilt trip was designed to break me, but it only served to clarify the stakes. Surrendering my signature would not buy me love or respect. It would only validate their strategy. It would teach them that whenever Kevin overextended his credit, they could simply isolate me until I paid his debts. I realized that the grandchildren were not just Sarah's weapons. They were the chains binding my parents to their own ruin. I deleted the voicemails. I silenced my phone. I finished my shift, wiped down the stainless steel counters, and walked out into the freezing Maine night. The physical weight of the isolation remained, heavy and ever-present, but my spine turned to steel. I refused to pick up the pen. My silence, however, was not enough to end the war. By Tuesday, the suppressed grief and the relentless pressure demanded a release. My refusal to bend forced the conflict out of the digital shadows and directly onto the wooden docks of the harbor, culminating in a messy public rupture I could no longer control. The pressure cooker of isolation does not forge a strategic mastermind overnight. Human endurance has a distinct physical limit. By Tuesday morning, the lack of sleep and the relentless barrage of voicemail notifications had stripped away my pragmatism. I did not handle the crushing weight of the family exile with cinematic grace. I did not formulate a brilliant counterattack while sipping coffee in the dark. Instead, the sheer, unadulterated exhaustion boiled over into a chaotic, imperfect rupture. Maine coastal storms in late November do not offer picturesque snowfall. They deliver a punishing, freezing rain that cuts sideways off the Atlantic, turning the harbor into a bleak canvas of gray. I finished the breakfast rush at the diner, my arches burning and my uniform smelling of stale grease. I should have driven back to my apartment above the hardware store to rest. Instead, a dangerous, erratic energy hijacked my nervous system. I grabbed the bundle of crumpled municipal tax receipts from my glove compartment, gripped the steering wheel, and steered my rusted sedan toward the commercial docks. Growing up, Kevin never had to raise his voice. When you are the golden son, the designated heir to a generational fishing legacy, the world bends to your quiet preferences. If Kevin wanted something, Thomas and Martha provided it. He learned early on that maintaining a calm, stoic exterior forced everyone else to scramble to appease him. I, on the other hand, spent my entire life swallowing my grievances, trained to be the invisible, accommodating sister. The dam holding back 3 decades of forced compliance shattered the moment I saw him on the pier. The Machias commercial harbor reeked of damp rope, dead herring, and raw petroleum. I parked near the cooperative loading zone. Through the sleet sliding down my windshield, I spotted the Martha Jane. The old wooden boat bobbed against the pilings. Kevin stood on the slippery wooden deck, loading heavy wire lobster traps. He wore his expensive, insulated waterproof gear, looking every bit the rugged New England captain, oblivious to the financial devastation he was causing on shore. I stepped out into the freezing downpour. I did not possess a cool, calculated speech. I did not plan my words. I marched down the slick wooden pier, the crumpled tax receipts clutched tight in my fist. I wanted to force him to look at the numbers. I wanted him to see the physical proof of my stolen wages. Vengeance rarely cooperates with gravity. The wooden planks of the commercial docks are coated in a perpetual layer of ocean slime and wet algae. Halfway down the pier, my worn work shoe lost its traction. My feet flew out from under me in a sudden, jarring arc. I slammed hard onto the unforgiving wood. My knees absorbed the brunt of the impact, tearing the fabric of my jeans and scraping raw skin. My purse slipped from my shoulder, teetering perilously close to the edge of the dock before snagging on a rusted iron cleat. It was a pathetic, agonizing fall. The pain radiating up my shins was immediate and sharp. I scrambled back to my feet, my clothes soaked in freezing rainwater and foul-smelling harbor sludge. The adrenaline spiked, mixing toxic with the humiliating stumble. The dignified confrontation I envisioned vanished, leaving only jagged nerve endings exposed to the freezing air. I limped the remaining distance to his slip. The idling diesel engine of the Martha Jane hummed a low, vibrating rhythm. I stood on the edge of the dock, looking down at my brother. I opened my mouth to deliver a sharp reprimand, but the words fractured in my throat. My voice cracked into a high, unfamiliar pitch. I started screaming over the chugging exhaust of the boat. It was an ugly, stammering rant fueled by sheer grief. I sobbed furiously, the tears mixing with the freezing rain running down my cheeks. I uncurled my fist and hurled the bundle of crumpled tax receipts directly at his chest. The wind caught the loose papers, scattering them across the wet wooden deck and into the dark, churning water below. I shrieked that he was a parasite. The word tore from my lungs, raw and desperate. I pointed a trembling finger at him, my voice breaking as I accused him of bleeding our parents dry to pay for his fragile pride. I screamed that using his own children as hostages was the act of a coward, not a captain. I yelled until my throat felt like sandpaper, pouring every ounce of the isolation and betrayal into the freezing storm. I did not look triumphant. I did not resemble a strong, vindicated protagonist laying down the law. I looked utterly unhinged. I was a soaking wet, bruised, weeping waitress screaming at the ocean. The harbor is not a private arena. The commercial docks are always active. 3 slips down. A crew of weathered deckhands stopped sorting their bait buckets, turning to stare at the hysterical woman on the pier. A group of tourists in bright rain jackets, standing near the adjacent seafood shack, paused to point and whisper. The public spectacle was undeniable. Kevin did not yell back. He did not defend himself or attempt to justify his extortion. He simply stood on the deck of his boat, wiping a stray piece of wet paper from his expensive jacket. He looked up at me with an expression that cut deeper than any insult he could have spoken. He looked at me with profound, condescending pity. He slowly shook his head, pressing his lips together in a tight line of disapproval. He looked at the deckhands watching us, then looked back at me, pantomiming a subtle gesture of embarrassment on my behalf. He treated me exactly like a frantic, hysterical lunatic who had forgotten to take her medication. He did not see a sister demanding justice. He chose to see a broken, unstable spinster throwing a public temper tantrum over a few dollars. The lack of a fight was devastating. His calm, dismissive demeanor amplified my own chaos. The realization of how I appeared to the onlookers hit me like a physical blow. The righteous anger drained out of my system in a rapid, dizzying rush, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating blanket of shame. I stood there shivering in the rain, my bruised knees throbbing, aware that I had just surrendered my dignity for nothing. The scattered tax receipts dissolved in the harbor water, carrying my evidence out with the tide. I turned my back on the boat and retreated. I walked as fast as my injured legs would carry me, keeping my head bowed to avoid the stares of the fishermen. I reached my rusted sedan, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the heavy door shut against the storm. I gripped the freezing plastic steering wheel with trembling fingers. My chest heaved with ragged breaths. I stared out the rain-streaked windshield at the gray harbor, feeling the sting of the torn skin on my knees and the bitter taste of defeat in my mouth. I had played directly into his hands by losing my composure in a public space. I handed him the exact narrative he needed. He now had an audience to corroborate his story. The golden son was just trying to work, and the unstable sister had attacked him. I put the car in gear and drove away from the docks, unaware that my messy, public outburst was not just a humiliating defeat. It was the crucial piece of evidence my brother would use to launch a devastating legal strike against my freedom. I thought I had hit rock bottom on the wet wooden pier, but the real trap had not even snapped shut. The physical bruises from my fall on the commercial docks faded over the next 14 days. The scraped skin on my knees scabbed over and turned a dull, fading purple. The psychological sting, however, lingered in the cramped corners of my apartment. I spent 2 weeks waiting for the next strike from the farmhouse. The silence was heavy and deceptive. My phone did not ring. My mother stopped leaving frantic voicemails. The sudden absence of their pressure felt unnatural, like the sudden drop in barometric pressure right before a major nor'easter hits the coast. I foolishly attributed the quiet to a temporary retreat. I assumed my very public, humiliating breakdown had convinced them I was a lost cause, prompting them to look elsewhere for Kevin's bailout money. I failed to realize that Kevin was not retreating. He was drafting a blueprint for my destruction. My dockside meltdown provided my brother with the exact ammunition he needed to launch a devastating counterattack. He took my raw, imperfect grief and sculpted it into a weapon of legal precision. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The coastal sky outside my window hung low and gray, promising another round of freezing sleet. I stood in the narrow kitchen of my apartment above the hardware store, pressing a hot iron over my uniform apron. The smell of spray starch and burnt cotton filled the small room. Down below, I could hear the heavy metal security gate of the hardware store rolling shut for the day. My dinner shift at the Route 1 diner started in an hour. I unplugged the iron and draped the crisp apron over the back of a wooden chair. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the exterior wooden staircase leading to my door. They were not the quick, frantic steps of a lost tourist or the familiar shuffle of the mail carrier. These footsteps carried the steady, rhythmic weight of official business. A sharp, authoritative knock rattled the wooden frame of my door. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, walked across the faded linoleum floor, and turned the deadbolt. A woman stood on my narrow landing. She looked to be in her late 40s, wearing practical, rubber-soled boots and a navy blue windbreaker shielding her from the biting coastal draft. A state-issued identification badge hung from a thick, woven lanyard around her neck, resting against a clipboard clutched tightly in her gloved hands. Her expression possessed the flat, neutral detachment of a professional who deals exclusively in bad news. She asked if she was speaking to Carol. I nodded, feeling a sudden, inexplicable drop in my stomach. She introduced herself as an investigator from the Maine Department of Health and Human Services. Specifically, she worked for the Adult Protective Services Division in Augusta, assigned to the Washington County jurisdiction. She stated her name and her title with a brisk efficiency that left no room for casual pleasantries. She unclipped a folded document from her board and held it out toward me. The words on the heavy cardstock blurred for a second before snapping into terrifying focus. It was a formal notice of a preliminary inquiry. The investigator explained the nature of her visit without raising her voice. She maintained a sterile, bureaucratic tone as she outlined the allegations filed against me. A formal report had been lodged by a concerned family member regarding the welfare of Thomas and Martha. The complainant alleged severe financial elder abuse, psychological manipulation, and willful neglect. I stood frozen in the doorway, the freezing wind whipping my hair across my face, listening to the investigator recite a narrative that inverted reality with breathtaking cruelty. Kevin had gone to the state. He had bypassed family arguments and weaponized the government. According to the formal complaint, I was a mentally unstable daughter, actively holding my parents' retirement trust fund hostage out of petty spite. Kevin claimed that by refusing to sign the trust decanting waiver, I was intentionally depriving two vulnerable seniors of the critical home equity they needed to pay for vital medical care and urgent structural repairs. He twisted the $80,000 boat bailout into a fictitious medical emergency for our father. He pointed to the crumbling roof of the farmhouse. The very roof I had already handed them $2,000 in cash to fix, as proof of my deliberate neglect. But the most devastating part of his report relied on the events at the harbor. Kevin utilized my messy, public outburst on the wooden pier as verified proof of my declining mental stability. He listed the deckhands and the passing tourists as potential witnesses to my erratic, hostile behavior. He framed the sobbing waitress, hurling crumpled receipts, as a dangerous predator aggressively harassing a devoted son who was just trying to protect his aging parents. The investigator handed me a trifold government pamphlet explaining my rights and the impending investigative process. She informed me that a caseworker would be assigned to audit my financial interactions with my parents. She stated that I was strictly prohibited from attempting to coerce Thomas or Martha into altering their statements. She delivered the information with the practiced routine of someone executing a legal mandate, entirely blind to the agonizing irony of the situation. This was no longer a family squabble over unpaid utility bills and a diesel truck. This was a systemic legal threat. In a sprawling city, an inquiry might remain hidden in a maze of paperwork. But in a small, insular coastal town like Machias, an elder abuse investigation is absolute public poison. Gossip travels faster than the tides in this region. If the rumor mill caught wind that the state was auditing my life for elder exploitation, my fragile existence would collapse. My survival depended entirely on my job at the diner. The owner, a pragmatic, no-nonsense local man who valued his community standing above all else, ran a tight ship. He relied on the patronage of the local fishermen, the municipal workers, and the church crowds. If state investigators started poking around the pie cases, asking questions about my character and pulling me into the kitchen for interrogations, he would not hesitate to protect his business. He would fire me instantly to preserve the pristine reputation of his establishment. I would lose my income, my ability to pay the rent above the hardware store, and my last remaining shred of dignity in the town I had called home my entire life. I looked at the woman in the windbreaker. I wanted to scream the truth at her. I wanted to grab my shoebox of bank statements and force her to look at the heating oil receipts and the municipal tax ledgers. I wanted to explain the brand new truck parked in my parents' driveway. But the hard lesson I learned on the docks stopped the words in my throat. Raw emotion is a severe liability in a legal fight. If I lost my temper now, if I raised my voice or wept in the doorway, I would only validate Kevin's claim that I was unstable. The state does not operate on empathy. It operates on evidence. I forced myself to maintain a calm, steady posture. I thanked the investigator for the information, accepting the notice and the pamphlet with a steady hand. She offered a curt nod, turned around, and descended the wooden stairs, her boots echoing against the metal railings. I closed the door and slid the deadbolt into place. The apartment felt smaller than it ever had, the walls pressing inward. I leaned my back against the heavy wood, holding the government notice in my trembling hands. The trap had snapped shut with terrifying efficiency. I was boxed in by the rigid machinery of the state bureaucracy. Kevin had weaponized a system specifically designed to protect vulnerable seniors, twisting its noble purpose to forge a bulletproof shield for his own extortion. By initiating a formal inquiry, he forced me into a defensive posture, forcing me to prove my innocence before I could ever expose his guilt. I realized then that my righteous anger had walked me straight into a massive snare. Shouting on a pier was a fool's game. If I was going to survive this audit and save my livelihood, I could not fight a paper war with tears and accusations. I needed an interpreter who spoke the cold, unforgiving language of the probate courts. I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. My shift was starting soon, but pouring coffee was no longer my primary concern. I needed to find a lawyer, and I needed to prepare for the agonizing reality that the justice system moves at a glacial, merciless pace. The morning after the investigator stood on my narrow landing, I requested a rare day off from the diner. I pulled my rusted sedan onto the highway and drove 90 miles inland toward Bangor. The coastal landscape of jagged rocks and gray ocean faded, replaced by dense, towering pine forests. Retaining an attorney meant unlocking the meager emergency fund I had spent 4 years building through double shifts and skipped meals. I parked outside a modest brick building near the Penobscot River. The cramped law office smelled of old paper, floor wax, and stale coffee. The probate attorney sat behind a heavy oak desk cluttered with manila case files. He possessed the tired, pragmatic demeanor of a man who spent his career untangling the messy financial disputes of grieving families. I sat in a rigid leather chair across from him, handing over the preliminary inquiry notice. Next, I pushed the heavy black binder containing the irrevocable trust documents across the desk. Finally, I placed my cardboard shoebox filled with highlighted bank statements and municipal tax receipts in front of him. I waited for him to offer a swift, decisive resolution. I harbored a naive expectation shaped by television procedurals. I wanted him to pick up his desk phone, call the state investigator in Augusta, read the dates on my highlighted bank statements, and force an immediate dismissal of the charges. I wanted the nightmare to end before my next dinner shift. The attorney adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, read through the formal notice, and set the paper down on his blotter. He looked at me with a sobering, heavy expression and systematically dismantled my assumptions. He explained that Adult Protective Services in Maine operates under a rigid, slow-moving bureaucratic mandate. They do not drop formal inquiries based on a single phone call or a box of receipts provided by the accused party. The government machinery requires exhaustive procedure. By filing the report, my brother had triggered an automatic evaluation protocol that could take up to 90 days to reach a formal conclusion. 90 days. The timeline struck me like a physical blow. For the next 3 months, my entire existence would be placed under a microscope. The attorney detailed the upcoming ordeal. The state would initiate rigorous financial audits, combing through every withdrawal, deposit, and transfer attached to my name for the past 5 years. They would likely freeze specific assets to prevent any alleged capital flight during the inquiry. They would demand formal, recorded interviews with every single member of the family, dissecting decades of domestic history to build a psychological profile. I could not simply present the truth and walk away. I had to endure the excruciating process of being treated like a criminal suspect while the state slowly verified my innocence. Then, the attorney delivered a stern, non-negotiable directive. He leaned across the desk, lowering his voice to emphasize the gravity of his instruction. I was strictly forbidden from contacting Kevin. I could not call him. I could not text him. And I certainly could not approach him at the commercial harbor. My brother had already established a documented narrative of my supposed instability on the wooden docks. If I confronted him again, even to demand an explanation or yell out of frustration, Kevin could easily file for a temporary restraining order. A restraining order would solidify his victim status in the eyes of the investigator and severely damage my credibility. The attorney warned me that Kevin would likely try to bait me. People who weaponize the legal system rely on their targets losing emotional control. I had to become a ghost to my own bloodline. If my parents reached out, I was to direct them to his law office. Every communication had to filter through official legal channels, stripping away the familial bond and replacing it with sterile, documented correspondence. I nodded, absorbing the harsh parameters of my new reality. I wrote a check for his retainer fee, watching my bank balance plummet to a terrifying low, and left the brick building feeling poorer and more vulnerable than ever. The drive back to Machias felt infinitely longer than the morning commute. The winter sun dipped below the tree line, casting long, chilling shadows across the 2-lane highway. I was trapped in a bureaucratic waiting room, powerless to speed up the clock. The justice system is not a swift sword. It is a slow, grinding mill. I had to endure the friction. The next morning, I tied my apron strings and walked out onto the diner floor. The stark contrast between my internal terror and my external duties bordered on surreal. I spent my days moving through a familiar routine that suddenly felt like a high-stakes performance. The brass bell above the door chimed, signaling the arrival of hungry locals and passing travelers. I smiled, greeted regulars by their first names, and balanced heavy trays of hot fish chowder, fried haddock, and blueberry pie. I poured countless cups of dark roast coffee while carrying the devastating weight of the inquiry. Every time the front door opened, a spike of adrenaline hit my chest, fearing it was the state investigator returning for an unannounced interrogation. I watched the local patrons chat about the upcoming winter festival and the dropping lobster prices, wondering if any of them had heard the rumors. In a small town, reputation is a fragile currency. I knew that if the diner owner caught a whisper of the elder abuse allegations, he would ask for my apron before the lunch rush ended. I moved through the weeks with a forced, mechanical cheerfulness. I wiped down the vinyl booths, scrubbed the stainless steel counters until they gleamed, and counted my meager tips at the end of every shift. I lived in a state of suspended animation. The 90-day countdown dictated my every waking thought. I could not plan for the future because my future hinged entirely on a caseworker flipping through a stack of financial ledgers in Augusta. I felt stripped of my autonomy, reduced to a case file number waiting for validation. But the passive waiting was not the most agonizing element of the bureaucratic trap. The state required comprehensive testimony to complete their evaluation. The investigator needed to interview the supposed victims of my financial crimes to build the official narrative. I knew Kevin would lie to protect his extortion scheme. I expected my brother to weave a tapestry of falsehoods to save his boat. What I did not expect was the profound, shattering betrayal that emerged from the formal interview transcripts. The true depth of the tragedy was not forged in a courtroom or a bait shed, but in the quiet, sworn testimony of the woman who raised me. The heaviest blows in a legal battle do not always arrive with the bang of a judge's gavel or the dramatic shouting of a courtroom cross-examination. Sometimes, the most devastating strike is delivered through the mail, wrapped in a plain manila envelope, resting quietly inside a metal postal box. December arrived in coastal Maine with a bitter, bone-chilling frost. The tourist season was a distant memory, leaving the Route 1 diner populated almost entirely by locals wearing heavy wool and insulated boots. I spent my days moving through the motions of my job, serving hot chowder and pouring coffee, carrying the invisible weight of the state investigation on my shoulders. I checked my mailbox every afternoon, dreading the arrival of official correspondence. 3 weeks into the 90-day waiting period, I found a thick envelope bearing the return address of my attorney in Bangor. I climbed the wooden stairs to my apartment, my work shoes heavy on the frozen steps. I did not bother turning on the television or the radio. The silence of the cramped space above the hardware store felt appropriate. I sat on my worn fabric sofa, the springs groaning softly under my weight, and slid my thumb under the adhesive flap of the envelope. Inside, I found a brief, clipped cover letter from my lawyer. He explained that Adult Protective Services had conducted their mandatory preliminary interviews with the alleged victims. Under state disclosure rules, the legal counsel for the accused is permitted to review the sworn statements to prepare a defense. He warned me to read the attached pages carefully and reminded me, yet again, to maintain a strict boundary of no contact. Beneath the cover letter lay a stark, black and white document printed in a sterile courier font. It was the official interview transcript between the state caseworker and my mother, Martha. To understand what reading that transcript felt like, you have to understand who my mother is. Martha was a high school homecoming queen who married a handsome, hardworking fisherman. She built her entire identity around the concept of the pristine, successful Down East family. She curated our public image with meticulous care, ensuring we always wore our Sunday best to church and brought the finest baked goods to the municipal bake sales. As she aged, that fierce need for social validation transferred entirely to her role as a grandmother. Being seen at the ice rink cheering for Kevin's boys was not just a pastime. It was the core of her existence. I turned the page and began to read the questions posed by the state investigator. The caseworker asked Martha to describe the origins of the irrevocable Medicaid Asset Protection Trust created 3 years ago. My eyes scanned the corresponding answer. The words printed on the page did not make sense at first. I had to read the paragraph 3 times before the reality of her statement settled into my brain. Martha lied. She did not merely stretch the truth or offer a confused interpretation of past events. She delivered a calculated, deliberate perjury to a state official under penalty of law. Martha testified that I had coerced them into signing the trust documents. She claimed that I had utilized my youth and my financial independence to intimidate them, threatening to abandon them to a subpar nursing facility if they did not put the ancestral farmhouse in my name. She painted a picture of a predatory daughter manipulating 2 frightened seniors into signing away their legacy. The investigator then asked about the current financial blockade. The caseworker inquired why I was refusing to sign the decanting waiver to release the $80,000 in home equity. Martha's recorded response felt like a sharp, serrated knife sliding between my ribs. She testified that I was hoarding their money out of pure, unadulterated spite. My mother utilized the exact same cruel narrative that Kevin had weaponized at the dining table. She told the government official that because I was an aging spinster with no husband and no children of my own, I harbored a deep, toxic resentment toward my brother. She claimed I was holding the family funds hostage simply to punish Kevin for having the beautiful family I had failed to build. I lowered the pages to my lap. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded deafening in the quiet apartment. My chest tightened, constricting my lungs until drawing a breath became a conscious, difficult effort. The betrayal was staggering in its scope. Sarah's vicious text message had worked perfectly. By banning the grandparents from the Thanksgiving table and threatening to withhold the boys on Christmas morning, Sarah had forced my mother into a corner. Martha faced the prospect of a silent, empty farmhouse during the holidays. She could not endure the perceived social humiliation of losing her grandsons. To buy her ticket back into the hockey rinks and the holiday gatherings, she needed to deliver my signature to Kevin. Since I refused to surrender, she chose to sacrifice my freedom instead. By swearing to these lies, Martha was actively validating an elder exploitation charge. In the state of Maine, financial abuse of a senior citizen is a felony. It carries the very real threat of severe fines and prison time. My own mother was willing to let me face criminal prosecution, willing to let the state destroy my livelihood, just to appease the son who was actively bankrupting them. She traded my future for a front row seat at a youth hockey game. American culture places a heavy, romanticized emphasis on the concept of maternal love. We are taught from childhood that a mother's devotion is fierce, protective, and entirely unconditional. We are told that a mother will stand between her child and any incoming threat. Sitting on my faded sofa, holding the notarized proof of my mother's perjury, that cultural myth shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Her love was highly conditional. It was contingent on my utility. As long as I was writing checks to pay the heating oil and property taxes, I was a good daughter. The moment I closed my checkbook and demanded respect, I became disposable collateral damage. A single tear spilled over my lower lash line, cutting a hot path down my cheek. Then another followed. I did not wail or scream as I had on the commercial docks. There was no chaotic energy left in my system. I just wept quietly. The tears soaked into the collar of my flannel shirt. I mourned the death of the family I thought I had. I cried for the years I had wasted pouring coffee and taping my shoes together to protect people who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient ATM. I sat there until the natural light outside my window faded into a deep, bruising purple. The hardware store below locked its doors for the night, the heavy metal latches echoing up through the floorboards. The quiet weeping eventually subsided, leaving behind a hollow, aching void in my chest. I picked up the transcript and carefully folded the heavy paper along its original creases. I slid the document back into the manila envelope and placed it on the coffee table. The profound grief slowly hardened into something else. The betrayal burned away the last lingering threads of familial guilt. I no longer questioned my sanity. I no longer wondered if I was being too harsh by refusing to sign the trust waiver. The gloves were officially off. They had brought the machinery of the state into my life, intending to crush me into submission. They assumed the threat of an elder abuse investigation would terrify me into signing the papers just to make the nightmare stop. What they failed to realize is that a person who has lost everything no longer operates out of fear. Kevin and Martha thought they had won by putting their lies on the official state record. They believed they had cornered me. I knew that Kevin, emboldened by my mother's sworn testimony and assuming the Adult Protective Services investigation had me cowering in my apartment, would soon grow dangerously arrogant. Predators who think they have successfully trapped their prey rarely stay quiet. They want to gloat. They want to parade their victory and watch their victims squirm. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stood up from the sofa. I prepared for my next shift, knowing my brother would not be able to resist bringing his newfound confidence directly into my only remaining safe space. The Route 1 diner on a Sunday morning operates like a well-oiled engine running at maximum capacity. By 7 o'clock, the parking lot is overflowing with rusted pickup trucks and municipal snowplows. The air inside the restaurant hangs heavy with the rich, dense smells of frying bacon, spilled maple syrup, and dark roast coffee. The windows are perpetually fogged with condensation from the bitter coastal cold clashing against the radiant heat of the flat-top grill. It is a loud, chaotic environment filled with the clinking of heavy ceramic mugs and the low, steady rumble of local gossip. Machias is a town where everyone knows your business, and the diner serves as the central hub for exchanging that currency. I moved through the narrow aisles between the vinyl booths with practiced efficiency, balancing heavy oval plates piled high with scrambled eggs and fried haddock. The profound grief that had crushed me on my living room sofa days earlier was gone. The tears had dried up entirely, leaving behind a cold, hardened resolve. Reading my mother's sworn perjury had burned away the last remnants of my familial guilt. I no longer viewed myself as a victim trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare. I was simply a woman waiting for the right moment to strike back. That moment arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. The brass bell fastened above the front door chimed sharply, cutting through the din of the breakfast rush. A blast of freezing air swept into the entryway. I looked up from wiping down a stainless steel counter and watched my brother swagger into the restaurant. Kevin did not attempt to keep a low profile. He wanted an audience. Through the frosted front windows, I could see his brand new Ford diesel truck idling in the prime parking spot near the entrance. He wore a pristine, expensive heavy canvas jacket over a thick fisherman sweater. He carried himself with the arrogant, inflated posture of a man who believed he had just won a war. Emboldened by our mother's lies and assuming the state investigation had me cowering in terror, he decided to bring his victory parade directly into my only remaining safe space. He wanted to humiliate me in front of my boss and my regular customers. He wanted to watch me squirm. He bypassed the open stools at the counter and walked directly toward my assigned section. He slid into booth number 4. A prime location situated right in the middle of the busiest part of the dining room. To his left sat a table of local lumberjacks wearing high-visibility yellow hoodies. To his right sat a booth packed with veteran fishermen, men who had hauled traps alongside our father decades ago. Kevin stretched his arms across the back of the red vinyl seat, flashing a smug, victorious grin in my direction. He was daring me to react. He wanted another dockside meltdown. He wanted me to scream and throw things so he could call the state investigator and report my erratic behavior. I did not give him the satisfaction. I did not drop my tray. My hands did not tremble. I walked over to the commercial coffee brewer, pulled a fresh pot of steaming dark roast off the burner, and retrieved a clean ceramic mug. I navigated the crowded aisle with a steady, measured pace. I approached his booth and placed the heavy white mug on the formica table. I poured the dark liquid, filling the cup to the brim without spilling a single drop. Kevin leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. He offered a condescending chuckle, preparing to deliver a whispered insult about the pending government inquiry. He opened his mouth to speak. I cut him off before he could form a single syllable. I leaned forward, resting my free hand flat against the edge of his table. I did not raise my voice to a frantic scream. I did not weep. I utilized a clear, conversational volume, pitching my words perfectly so they would cut through the ambient noise and reach the ears of the men sitting in the adjacent booth. I asked him how he planned to pay his outstanding invoices at the Harbor Cooperative. The smug grin on his face faltered, freezing into a mask of sudden confusion. I kept my tone casual, as if we were discussing the winter weather forecast. I noted that the primary bait suppliers down on the commercial docks were complaining loudly about his delinquent accounts. I mentioned by name the specific trap maker who had been calling his cell phone for 3 weeks. Noting that the man was tired of Kevin dodging his calls, I asked if the bank was still threatening to seize his boat slip, or if he was just planning to hide his new diesel truck so the repo men could not find it. In a sprawling metropolis, airing a person's financial struggles might just be considered rude. But in a rugged Maine fishing community, it is a lethal, calculated strike. Down East Maine operates on a strict, unspoken code of honor. In the commercial fishing industry, credit is rarely based on formal bank approvals or extensive paperwork. It is built entirely on reputation and a firm handshake. A captain is only as good as his word. If you buy your salted herring on credit, you pay the supplier the moment you sell your catch. If you cannot pay your debts, you face your creditors like a man and negotiate a timeline. Dodging phone calls and hiding from suppliers is the ultimate sin. It signals to the entire harbor that you are untrustworthy. Exposing a captain as a deadbeat ruins his standing faster than a sunken vessel. My clear, projecting voice carried effortlessly across the aisle. The diner possesses a unique acoustic quality, and the sudden mention of unpaid cooperative bills acted like a magnet for the locals. The heavy clinking of silverware at the adjacent tables ceased. The group of veteran fishermen in Booth 3 stopped chewing their toast. They turned their heads, their weathered faces etched with sudden, intense scrutiny, staring directly at the golden sun of the local fleet. The lumberjacks to his left paused their conversation, casting heavy, judgmental glances toward his pristine canvas jacket. Kevin realized instantly that he was surrounded by his peers. The men who dictated the social hierarchy of the harbor were listening to every word I said. The transition in my brother was immediate and staggering to witness. The arrogant, untouchable posture collapsed. The smug superiority vanished from his eyes, replaced by a raw, sheer panic. He shrank back into the vinyl booth, pulling his arms inward as if trying to make himself smaller. A deep, furious crimson flush crept up his neck, spreading rapidly across his cheeks and forehead. His carefully curated image of a highly successful, prosperous lobsterman fractured into a million irreparable pieces under the harsh fluorescent lights. He opened his mouth to deny the accusations, to call me a liar, but he looked at the hardened faces of the fishermen staring at him. He knew they would check the harbor ledger. He knew the bait suppliers would confirm my story by the end of the day. Any defense he offered now would only dig his grave deeper. Kevin grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He scrambled to slide out of the booth, his heavy boots catching awkwardly on the metal table leg. He stood up, his face burning red with unmitigated humiliation. He did not look at me. He did not look at the men watching him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $1 bill, and threw it onto the formica surface to pay for the coffee he had not even touched. He turned and practically ran toward the exit. He shoved the glass door open, the brass bell chiming a frantic, chaotic rhythm in his wake. He jogged through the freezing parking lot, climbed into his expensive truck, and sped away, his tires spinning uselessly on the icy asphalt before catching traction. I stood by the empty booth. Holding the glass coffee pot, I picked up the crumpled dollar bill, slid it into my apron pocket, and wiped the table clean with a damp rag. The veteran fisherman in the next booth offered me a quiet, respectful nod before returning to their breakfasts. The confrontation provided a sharp, satisfying rush of vindication. I had exposed his charade to the exact audience he desperately wanted to impress. But as I walked back to the kitchen, the adrenaline faded, replaced by the cold reality of my situation. Humiliating Kevin in a diner did not erase the formal inquiry filed in Augusta. It did not cancel the impending financial audit or undo my mother's perjury. Emotional victories offer temporary comfort, but they do not hold up in a court of law. If I wanted to dismantle his extortion scheme and secure my freedom, I had to stop fighting him with words. I needed to let the municipal government do the fighting for me. It was time to build a paper trail so undeniable that the state investigators would have no choice but to turn their scrutiny away from me and aim it directly at the golden sun. Humiliating Kevin provided a fleeting rush of adrenaline, but the cold dawn of Monday morning brought a harsh reality check. Verbal victories do not hold weight in a court of law. State investigators do not care about flushed faces or diner gossip. They operate strictly on documented facts. My mother's sworn perjury stated that I was hoarding their retirement funds and withholding their own money out of petty spite. To defeat a lie of that magnitude, I had to stop relying on emotional appeals and shift my strategy entirely to clinical logic. The truth always leaves a paper trail, and I needed to gather the receipts. I sat at my Formica kitchen table and reviewed the mechanical flow of my finances over the past half-decade. I realized a crucial flaw in Kevin's extortion narrative. While I had foolishly handed my parents cash in envelopes for fictitious roof repairs and imaginary medical debts, I had never trusted them with the funds for the essential utilities. Because I feared the farmhouse falling into tax default, I always paid the municipal bills directly. I wrote personal checks to the Machias town clerk for their property taxes. I paid the local heating oil distributor directly from my own checking account. My name was permanently attached to the survival of that coastal property. I requested Tuesday and Wednesday mornings off from my breakfast shifts. I traded my stained apron for a neat wool sweater and drove to the Machias Town Hall. The municipal building is a stout, weathered brick structure sitting near the tidal river, smelling faintly of floor wax wet wool and old decaying paper. The local government does not rely on sleek, instantaneous digital databases. The public archives consist of heavy, clunky metal filing cabinets and thick ledger books bound in cracked leather. Getting information required, navigating a tedious, archaic system run by career clerks who move at a very specific, unhurried pace. I approached the front counter and requested certified copies of the property tax ledgers for my parents' parcel, spanning the last 5 years. The clerk, a woman I had served coffee to hundreds of times, looked surprised, but handed over the requisite request forms. I filled out the paperwork, paid the exorbitant processing fees from my dwindling checking account, and waited on a hard wooden bench. The rhythmic thumping of the municipal copy machine echoed down the hallway. I spent hours sitting in that drafty lobby, exchanging pleasantries with the staff, while quietly building the foundation of my legal defense. The tax records were only the first layer of the defense. I moved on to the water utility department down the hall, pulling the payment histories for the farmhouse. Every single quarterly invoice bore the signature of my personal bank routing number. When I finished at the town hall, I drove to the local bank branch on Main Street. I requested official stamped images of my cleared checks and debit transactions directed to the regional heating oil distributor. The bank teller printed page after page of transaction histories chronicling the thousands of dollars I had poured into the oil tank behind my parents' property just to keep them warm through the brutal Maine winters. It took 3 weeks of relentless administrative legwork to gather the necessary documents. The delays were maddening. Forms had to be mailed, notarized, and processed by various local agencies. But the slow, deliberate effort yielded a staggering result. I returned to my cramped apartment above the hardware store and spread the certified pages across my living room floor. I organized the documents chronologically matching every tax payment, water bill, and oil delivery to the corresponding date. The visual impact of the compiled data was undeniable. The printed ink told a story that shattered my mother's sworn testimony. The government records proved unequivocally that I was not a bitter spinster hoarding my parents' wealth. I was the sole financial pillar keeping their ancestral home from sliding into foreclosure. I compiled the certified ledgers, the bank images, and the utility receipts into a thick, heavy binder. I placed clear plastic tabs on the most crucial transactions, highlighting the undeniable pattern of my financial support. I did not bother drafting an emotional letter to the state caseworker. I did not attempt to explain Kevin's failing commercial fishing business or his new diesel truck. I let the Municipal ink do the fighting for me. I packed the heavy binder into my rusted sedan and drove the 90 miles back to Bangor. I walked into the probate attorney's office and placed the binder squarely on his cluttered oak desk. He opened the cover expecting a scattered collection of handwritten notes or disorganized bills. Instead, he found a meticulously curated, bulletproof legal defense built on state and local public records. He turned the pages, tracing the lines of municipal stamps and certified bank signatures. A slow, genuine smile spread across his weathered face. He looked up and told me that this was the exact kind of empirical evidence the bureaucratic machinery required. The attorney drafted a formal cover letter, citing the enclosed municipal tax ledgers. He submitted the heavy binder directly to the Adult Protective Services investigator, assigned to my case. The burden of proof shifted instantly. I was no longer a frantic daughter trying to defend herself against a coordinated family lie. I was a documented caretaker, possessing certified government receipts to prove my innocence. My mother had sworn under penalty of perjury that I was withholding their money. The Machias town clerk proved that I was the only person paying their bills. Sitting in the Bangor law office, listening to the attorney explain the next steps, the lingering fear in my chest finally dissipated. I had systematically dismantled Kevin's accusation piece by piece without raising my voice or shedding a single tear. I utilized the cold, unforgiving nature of public records to build a fortress around my livelihood. But providing evidence of my innocence was only the first phase of the legal process. When an investigator receives undeniable proof that an alleged abuser is actually the primary financial provider, the parameters of the inquiry change rapidly. The state caseworker now had a glaring discrepancy on her desk. The alleged victims claimed they were broke because of me, yet my documents proved I was funding their survival. The investigator needed to know where my parents' actual retirement income was going. To answer that question, the state would have to look past the waitress pouring coffee and aim their formidable auditing power directly at the man who initiated the complaint. I drove back to the coast, knowing my brother had just invited a forensic audit into his own chaotic financial life. The machinery of the government operates with a cold and indifferent momentum. Once you feed it undeniable proof, the gears shift directions without apology or hesitation. January arrived on the Maine coast, bringing a bitter, punishing freeze that turned the harbor into a landscape of cracked ice and gray skies. I spent those weeks working double shifts at the diner, watching the snow pile up against the frosted windows. The oppressive fear that had haunted my waking hours slowly dissolved. I knew my municipal binder sat on a desk in Augusta, doing the silent, heavy lifting I could never accomplish with shouting on a wooden pier. The state caseworker cross referenced my certified tax ledgers and oil delivery receipts with the sworn testimony provided by my mother. The contradiction was glaring and impossible to ignore. The alleged victims claimed they were destitute because I withheld their funds. Yet the public archives proved I was the sole entity keeping their furnace running and their property out of foreclosure. Faced with this stark, numerical reality, the investigator needed to answer a new crucial question. If the daughter was paying the bills, where was the parent's actual retirement income going? The caseworker pivoted her scrutiny away from my cramped apartment and aimed it directly at the man who initiated the complaint. In his original report, Kevin framed himself as the devoted primary caregiver, stepping in to protect his vulnerable parents from my supposed neglect. The state demanded documentation to verify his noble claim. The investigator issued a formal administrative subpoena for all of his banking records. Kevin panicked. He did not expect the bureaucracy to turn its magnifying glass on him. Growing up, he never faced the unyielding edge of systemic accountability. Whenever a teenage Kevin made a mistake, Thomas shielded him from the fallout. When my brother crashed a borrowed skiff into a wooden piling at 16, our father quietly handed the owner a thick envelope of cash to keep the local police uninvolved. Kevin carried that insulated entitlement into adulthood, genuinely believing the law was flexible for men of a certain status. He hired a budget defense lawyer to fight the subpoena, arguing the request was an invasive overreach into his private commercial fishing enterprise. He claimed the state had no right to audit a hardworking local captain based on a family misunderstanding. His legal maneuvering succeeded in delaying the process for another agonizing month. February dragged on with relentless coastal gales, tearing shingles off local roofs. I kept pouring coffee and serving hot chowder, watching the local news for storm warnings, while waiting for the legal system to grind forward. Kevin strutted around town, projecting an aura of untouchable confidence, but the delay tactics were bleeding his limited cash reserves dry. The state of Maine does not abandon an elder abuse inquiry simply because a suspect hires a loud attorney. The administrative judge reviewed the discrepancy in the financial statements and overruled the objection. The judge signed a court order compelling the local credit union to release every ledger deposit slip and wire transfer associated with both his personal name and the Martha Jane. The bank surrendered the documents without hesitation. The state forensic auditors began their clinical dissection of his life. Financial investigators do not care about a captain's rugged reputation or the pristine condition of his new diesel truck. They do not care who your father is or how many hockey games your sons win. They look for numerical anomalies and unexplained capital flows. The auditors quickly mapped the grim reality of his commercial fishing business. They documented the crippling boat loans, the mounting past due slip fees, and the exorbitant monthly payments for the heated leather seats he loved to flaunt. They saw a man drowning in localized debt, fighting to maintain an expensive lifestyle he could not afford. But as they dug deeper into the deposit columns, they discovered the true source of his financial life raft. It was a chilling revelation that elevated his actions from poor business management to a severe statutory crime. Kevin was not just receiving occasional cash handouts from our indulgent parents. He was running a systematic interception operation. Every month, the federal government mailed physical Social Security checks to the drafty coastal farmhouse. Kevin, playing the role of the attentive, devoted son, made a habit of collecting their mail under the guise of helping them manage their complicated correspondence. The auditors found the scanned images of those federal checks resting squarely within his commercial banking file. He had flipped the gray paper over, forged our father's signature on the endorsement line, and funneled the federal funds directly into his own business account. He used stolen government benefits to pay his bait suppliers and finance his truck. He committed federal mail fraud and severe elder financial exploitation to keep his fragile illusion afloat. The theft was brazen and incredibly foolish, leaving a permanent ink trail that led directly to his own doorstep. He thought he was outsmarting the system, but he was simply documenting his own guilt. My attorney called me on a Tuesday afternoon. The lunch rush had just ended, and I was wiping down the stainless steel pie case near the register. I saw the Bangor area code flash on my phone screen. I untied my apron, handed my cleaning cloth to a busboy, and stepped out through the rear kitchen door into the freezing alleyway. The cold air stung my cheeks as I pressed the phone to my ear, bracing myself for more administrative delays. The lawyer delivered the news with a tone of quiet astonishment. He explained the catastrophic way the audit had backfired. He detailed the forged signatures and the intercepted federal funds. The irony of the situation was staggering. Kevin had weaponized the Adult Protective Services Division, intending to frame me for the exact crime he was actively committing. He assumed his status as the golden son would protect him from any reciprocal scrutiny. Instead, by filing a false report against his sister, he had inadvertently invited a team of forensic auditors to uncover his own federal offenses. He built the gallows, tied the noose, and handed the lever directly to the state investigator. I stood in the alleyway watching my own breath form white clouds in the freezing air. The profound relief washing over me was mixed with a cold, hard disbelief. My brother had lost the moral high ground the moment he stole from our parents, but now he had lost his freedom. He walked himself straight into the crosshairs of a criminal investigation. The state investigator formally cleared my name, closing the inquiry into my finances with an official letter of exoneration. I was no longer a suspect hiding in the shadows of my own town. But the bureaucratic machinery was not finished with our family. It had simply acquired a much larger target. The lawyer warned me that the fallout would be swift and merciless. To protect my parents' remaining assets, while the district attorney prepared a potential criminal probe, the state was going to initiate an immediate financial lockdown. The artificial warmth my parents enjoyed subsidizing their favorite child with stolen funds was about to run out. The harsh winter was about to become much colder for the people who sat at a dining table and laughed at my empty house. I ended the call, slid the phone into my pocket, and walked back inside to finish my shift, knowing the final collapse of the farmhouse was only days away. Thanksgiving week arrived in Washington County, not with the festive anticipation of holiday gatherings, but with a brutal, unforgiving cold front, pulling down directly from the Canadian Maritimes. The coastal winds whipped across the gray waters of the Atlantic, stripping the last remaining dead leaves from the oak trees and coating the harbor docks in a treacherous layer of black ice. The temperature plummeted into the single digits long before the sun dipped beneath the horizon. It was the kind of fierce, piercing cold that finds every microscopic crack in a window frame and seeps into the marrow of your bones. On Monday afternoon, I walked up the exterior wooden stairs to my apartment, my breath forming dense white clouds in the frigid air. I unlocked my metal mailbox and pulled out a stack of envelopes. Nestled between a circular for a local hardware sale and a water bill was a thick, heavy envelope bearing the official seal of the Maine Department of Health and Human Services. I did not wait to take off my heavy wool coat. I stepped into my kitchen, flicked on the overhead light, and tore the adhesive flap open with numb fingers. The letter inside consisted of 2 crisp pages of state letterhead. The language was sterile, bureaucratic, and profoundly beautiful. The Adult Protective Services Division officially concluded their inquiry into my conduct. Based on the overwhelming certified financial evidence I provided, the state formally exonerated me of all charges regarding elder financial abuse and neglect. The caseworker explicitly noted that the public tax ledgers and heating oil receipts proved I was the sole financial stabilizer for the property. The file bearing my name was permanently closed. I stood in my small kitchen, gripping the edge of the Formica table, feeling a weight lift from my chest that I had carried for months. The government acknowledged the truth, but the machinery of the state did not simply power down after clearing my name. The undeniable evidence of theft remained on the investigator's desk. The focus shifted entirely toward the man who had forged federal documents. Simultaneously, the Department of Health and Human Services officially flagged Kevin for severe financial exploitation. Intercepting and forging an endorsement on a federal Social Security check elevates a family dispute into a federal jurisdiction. The state investigator handed the forensic audit over to the district attorney, who immediately began preparing a formal criminal probe. To protect Thomas and Martha from any further capital extraction while the authorities built their case against my brother, the state executed a mandatory protocol. The administrative judge issued an emergency injunction, placing a temporary freeze on my parents' primary checking and savings accounts. The government effectively padlocked their finances to preserve whatever meager funds remained, preventing Kevin from draining another dime to pay his boat loans. The fallout from the judicial freeze was instantaneous and catastrophic. For the past 5 years, my parents relied on a carefully balanced illusion. They maintained the appearance of comfortable retirees while secretly funneling their own fixed income to their golden son, relying on my covert waitress tips to cover their actual survival costs. By pushing me away and dragging the government into our lives, they inadvertently severed both of their lifelines. I was no longer writing checks to the municipal clerk. Now their own bank cards were rendered useless pieces of plastic. The reality of their self-inflicted poverty hit them at the local grocery store. I heard the gossip from a cashier who frequented the diner. Martha attempted to purchase her expensive Thanksgiving groceries on Tuesday morning, loading her cart with a premium turkey fresh cranberries and imported cheeses intended to impress her daughter-in-law. When she swiped her debit card, the machine beeped a harsh red decline. She tried a second card and received the same result. The cashier informed her that the bank had placed a hard hold on the accounts. Martha was forced to abandon her cart in the middle of the checkout lane, walking out of the store with burning cheeks and empty hands. But missing a holiday meal was the least of their impending disasters. The true crisis materialized behind their drafty farmhouse in the form of a rusted cylindrical tank. Heating a sprawling, aging coastal property in Maine requires a staggering amount of fuel. My parents utilized an old forced air oil furnace that burned through liquid currency at a terrifying rate. During my years of servitude, I monitored the gauge on that tank, like a hawk ensuring it never dropped below a quarter-full calling. The distributor and paying the delivery fees with my own debit card. Now that gauge rested firmly on empty. Thomas spent my entire childhood holding court in his living room, mocking families who could not afford cordwood or oil. He measured a man's worth by the warmth of his hearth. He prided himself on keeping his house sweltering during the darkest months of the year, projecting an image of rugged self-sufficiency. As the November cold front intensified, the furnace in the farmhouse sputtered and died. The temperature inside the sprawling house began to drop rapidly, mirroring the freezing temperatures outside. Without access to their frozen bank accounts, Thomas could not call the local oil distributor to order a refill. In Machias, fuel companies require a minimum delivery of 100 gallons, and they demand payment upon delivery for anyone lacking pristine credit. My parents' reputation was already tainted by Kevin's unpaid bait bills at the harbor. The distributor refused to extend a line of credit to a family currently under investigation by the district attorney. The oil trucks rumbled down Route 1, bypassing the farmhouse entirely. On Wednesday night, the wind howled off the ocean, rattling the single-pane windows of my apartment. I sat on my faded sofa, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping a mug of hot chamomile tea. The radiator hissed and clanked in the corner, pumping glorious mechanical heat into my small living space. I savored the warmth, knowing I had earned every single degree of it through my own honest labor. At 8 o'clock, my cell phone illuminated on the coffee table. The screen displayed my father's name. I set my mug down and let the device ring 3 times. The last time Thomas called me, he utilized a dark, authoritative tone, threatening to cut ties with me if I did not correct my disobedience. He demanded I surrender my inheritance to save his favored son. I picked up the phone and pressed it to my ear, offering a simple greeting. The voice on the other end of the line was unrecognizable. The jovial arrogance he displayed at the Sunday dinner table was gone. The demanding patriarchal thunder he used in the driveway had vanished. His voice trembled, a fragile, thin sound, shaking with the deep, bone-chilling cold of an unheated house. He did not ask how I was doing. He bypassed the small talk, dropping his pride onto the frozen floorboards. He begged me to come over. He pleaded for a cash advance of $500, just enough to meet the minimum delivery requirement for the oil truck. He told me the house was sitting at 40 degrees and dropping. He said Martha was wearing her winter coat under 2 layers of blankets, shivering uncontrollably. I listened to the desperation in his voice, noting the glaring absence of the golden sun in his narrative. I asked him why he did not call Kevin for the money. The silence on the line stretched for a long, agonizing moment. Thomas finally admitted that Kevin was unreachable. The district attorney had officially served Kevin with a grand jury subpoena that very afternoon, demanding his appearance to testify regarding the forged federal checks. Kevin's wife, Sarah, had packed their 3 boys into her pristine sport utility vehicle and driven to her sister's house in Portland, fleeing the impending criminal charges and the social humiliation. Kevin was currently barricaded inside his leased bait shed, ignoring his phone, drowning in his own legal panic. The man who was supposed to carry on the family legacy, the son who was worth sacrificing my future for, had abandoned them the moment the money ran dry. Kevin left his parents stranded in a freezing house, facing the brutal consequences of the fraud they helped him commit. The illusion of their perfect family had collapsed entirely. The curated social media posts, the bragged about hockey tournaments, the pristine Sunday church appearances, all of it burned away, leaving nothing but ash and frost. They traded their dutiful daughter for a thief who only valued them for their signatures. Thomas wept quietly into the receiver, asking me to remember the good times, asking me to have mercy on an old man. He thought the bond of blood would override the profound betrayal. He believed the instinct to rescue them was so deeply ingrained in my nature that a few tears would compel me to open my wallet once again. He assumed the daughter who wore taped shoes to pay his taxes would never let him freeze. I did not hang up the phone in anger. I did not yell at him for the perjury or the Adult Protective Services nightmare. I spoke with a calm, measured clarity, telling him I would drive over to the farmhouse the following morning. I ended the call and set the phone back on the coffee table. I finished my hot tea, watching the frost creep up the edges of my window pane. I intended to keep my promise to visit them on Thanksgiving morning, but I had no intention of bringing a checkbook. I was going to bring them the grim, undeniable reality of the trap they built themselves. Thanksgiving morning in America is traditionally defined by a specific set of sensory details. You expect the rich aroma of roasting turkey filtering through warm hallways, the muffled sounds of a televised parade in the background, and the comforting hum of a working furnace holding the winter chill at bay. My drive down the winding coastal highway offered none of those comforts. The main sky hung low and heavy, painted the color of bruised iron. The ocean battered the rocky shoreline, churning up freezing gray foam. I gripped the steering wheel of my rusted sedan, letting the rattling heater blow lukewarm air against my knuckles. I was heading toward the ancestral farmhouse, but I was not arriving to celebrate. I pulled onto the gravel driveway and shifted the car into park. The yard presented a chaotic, jarring scene. The pristine picture of coastal retirement my parents worked so hard to project had shattered into disorganized debris. A large rented moving truck sat parked at a crooked angle near the front porch. The heavy metal loading ramp extended down onto the frozen grass. My brother Kevin was dragging a stack of taped cardboard boxes out of the front door. The bank holding the mortgage on his personal home had finally executed the foreclosure. Commercial lenders do not observe holiday amnesties when federal fraud is involved. With his commercial fishing accounts frozen and his local credit destroyed by the harbor rumors, Kevin possessed no capital to halt the eviction process. His wife had already fled to Portland with their boys, taking the last remnants of his curated social image with her. Kevin was left alone to clear out his belongings before the county sheriff arrived to change the locks. The rugged, untouchable lobsterman who strutted into my diner days earlier was gone. He looked 10 years older. His expensive canvas jacket bore dark grease stains, and his shoulders sagged under the weight of the boxes. His face, usually flushed with unearned arrogance, was drawn and pale in the bitter morning wind. He paused on the metal ramp, holding a box of kitchen supplies, and watched me step out of my car. We locked our gazes across the frosty yard. There was no dockside screaming. There were no hurled insults or crumpled tax receipts. The fight had drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow, frantic exhaustion. I did not offer a greeting. I did not ask about his eviction or offer to help him carry his belongings. I turned away, climbed the wooden steps of the farmhouse, and pushed the heavy oak door open. Stepping into the house felt like walking into a meat locker. When a residential heating system fails in late November, the temperature drops rapidly, but the stagnant indoor air makes the chill feel far more piercing than the wind outside. The faint smell of cold ash drifted from the dead fireplace. I walked through the dark hallway and entered the kitchen. Thomas and Martha sat at the center of the wooden dining table. The visual impact of their self-inflicted poverty was staggering. My parents wore heavy winter parkas zipped up to their chins. Martha had wrapped a thick wool scarf around her neck and wore knitted gloves. Thomas sat with his hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets. Every time they exhaled, their breath formed distinct white clouds in the frigid air. The physical toll of the plunging temperature was evident in the stiff, rigid way they held their shoulders, trying desperately to preserve body heat. They looked up when I walked into the room. Their faces transformed instantly, shifting from frozen misery to a desperate, expectant relief. Thomas tried to muster a patriarchal smile, a weak imitation of the authority he used to command. He shifted in his wooden chair, assuming the dynamic of our family remained intact despite the government intervention. He assumed I was still the dutiful, conditioned daughter who placed their comfort above my own survival. He believed I had driven down the icy highway to hand over a cash advance, fill the rusted oil tank in the backyard, and restore the artificial warmth they felt entitled to. They stared at my leather purse, waiting for me to pull out my checkbook and save the holiday. I stood at the end of the table. I did not take off my coat. I did not offer a comforting apology for the cold. I unlatched the brass clasp of my purse and reached inside. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not produce an envelope stuffed with hard-earned waitress tips. I withdrew the crisp, folded state document I had received in the mail 2 days prior. I smoothed the heavy paper out with the palm of my hand and laid it flat on the frozen wooden table. I slid the official letter from the Department of Health and Human Services toward the center of the table, making sure the embossed state seal caught the dim light filtering through the frosted window panes. I told them to read it. Thomas pulled a trembling hand from his coat pocket and slid his reading glasses down the bridge of his nose. He leaned forward, squinting at the sterile, bureaucratic font. Martha leaned in beside him, her gloved fingers gripping the edge of the table. They read the formal declaration of my innocence. They read the caseworker's explicit summary detailing how the municipal tax ledgers and heating oil receipts proved I was their sole financial provider. They read the paragraphs closing the elder abuse inquiry, formally rejecting the malicious perjury Martha had sworn under oath. The document did not just exonerate me. It served as a stark, printed mirror reflecting their own complicity. The state of Maine recognized that they had weaponized a protective agency to extort the very person keeping a roof over their heads. Before either of them could formulate a response, the heavy wooden door leading from the kitchen to the mudroom swung open. Kevin walked inside, carrying a tangle of extension cords and a plastic bin filled with commercial fishing gear. He stopped in his tracks when he saw me standing at the head of the table. The freezing draft from the open door swirled around his boots. Kevin dropped the plastic bin onto the linoleum floor. He walked slowly toward the table, his eyes fixed on the heavy state letterhead resting between our parents. He recognized the seal. He knew exactly what agency utilized that specific stationery, because he was the one who had invited them into our lives. He looked at the printed words, the realization crashing over him with the weight of a collapsing tidal wave. He realized his extortion scheme had failed spectacularly. By trying to frame me for financial neglect, he had initiated the forensic audit that exposed his own federal crimes. He stood in the freezing kitchen, surrounded by the physical evidence of his ruin. The bank had taken his home. His wife had taken his children. The local cooperative had blacklisted his boat. And the district attorney was currently drafting an indictment for forging federal Social Security checks. His toxic pride had cost him everything. He gambled his entire livelihood just to maintain the illusion of a prosperous captain. And he had lost the wager in the most humiliating way possible. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Martha. He finally looked at me. His face crumpled, the arrogant facade melting away to reveal a terrified, broken man facing the imminent loss of his freedom. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg for another bailout, but no words came out. There was no shouting in the kitchen. The chaotic screaming match on the commercial docks felt like a lifetime ago. The silence in the room was profound, heavy, and suffocating. The lack of a fight was the most devastating element of the confrontation. My parents sat frozen in their heavy coats, staring at the paper that proved they had traded their loyal daughter for a criminal. Kevin stood shivering by the mudroom door, a captain without a ship, facing the crushing machinery of the federal justice system. The absolute devastation hanging in the frigid air was louder than any argument could ever be. I watched them absorb the grim reality of the trap they had built for themselves. They had dug a pit intended for my future, and they had all fallen into it together. I knew the expected protocol for this moment. Society dictates that when your family hits rock bottom, you reach down and pull them out, regardless of the scars they gave you. They were waiting for me to break the silence, to offer a compromise, to slide a few $100s across the table just to get the furnace running for the weekend. They were waiting for the dutiful waitress to resume her post. But the woman who used to tape her shoes together to pay their taxes no longer existed. The state letter on the table was not an invitation to negotiate. It was the foundation of an impenetrable wall I was about to build right through the center of our fractured bloodline. The silence holding the freezing kitchen hostage finally broke, shattered by the sound of my mother weeping. Martha did not cry with quiet dignity. She employed the same frantic, gasping sobs she used to deploy during my childhood whenever she needed to manipulate a situation or avoid taking responsibility for her actions. The sound echoed off the cold linoleum floors and the frost-covered window panes. Her tears were a calculated emotional transaction, a desperate attempt to wash away the perjury documented on the state letterhead resting in front of her. She leaned forward in her wooden chair, the heavy winter parka bunching around her shoulders, and reached her gloved hands across the table. She grabbed my left wrist. Her grip was tight, bordering on frantic. She began apologizing in a rapid, disjointed stream of consciousness. She begged for forgiveness, her breath pluming in the frigid air with every fractured syllable. She claimed they were entirely blinded by their devotion to the grandchildren. She painted a pathetic picture of two terrified grandparents facing the agonizing prospect of an empty house on Christmas morning. She spun a narrative where Sarah was the true villain, holding the boys hostage, and she was merely a desperate victim trying to preserve her family. She wanted me to believe that lying to a government investigator and framing her own daughter for a felony was simply an unfortunate mistake born from an excess of maternal love. I looked down at her gloved fingers, wrapped tightly around my wrist. I felt the familiar pull of domestic conditioning, the deeply ingrained urge to soothe her anxiety and absorb her guilt. For 35 years, my role in this family was to play the shock absorber. I was supposed to accept her excuses, wipe away her tears, and smooth over the rough edges of their poor decisions. But reading her sworn testimony in that cramped apartment days earlier had permanently severed that specific nerve. Her tears did not register as genuine sorrow. They registered as a desperate strategy to access my bank account. I did not offer a comforting word. I did not tell her everything would be fine. I gently twisted my arm and pulled my hand away from her grasp. The physical detachment hung in the cold air, a silent but definitive rejection of her emotional extortion. Martha stared at her empty hands, her weeping stalling into a stunned, breathless hiccup. She looked at Thomas, seeking backup from the patriarch. Thomas cleared his throat. He shifted his weight, his worn boots scraping against the floorboards. The emotional display unsettled him, so he reverted to the only language he truly understood. He bypassed the apologies, ignored the state exoneration letter sitting between us, and pivoted directly to the immediate logistical crisis. The house was dropping below 40 degrees, and the oil tank out back was bone dry. He needed a solution, and he still viewed me as his personal emergency fund. He leaned back, attempting to project a hollow remnant of his former authority. His voice shook with the penetrating cold, but he managed to force a polite, businesslike tone. He asked me for a small loan. He used that exact phrasing, trying to dress up his begging in a suit of financial dignity. He requested $500, just enough cash to cover the minimum delivery requirement from the local distributor to get the forced air furnace running for the holiday weekend. He promised he would pay me back the moment the government unfroze their checking accounts. The audacity of his request suspended the room in a surreal, suffocating tension. The golden sun was standing by the mudroom door, a ruined man waiting for a federal indictment because he stole their retirement funds. The state had just formally cleared me of the horrific crimes my own mother accused me of committing. Their entire legacy was collapsing around their ears. Yet, sitting in the ruins of their own making, my father still expected me to pull out a checkbook. They had learned nothing. They did not regret the betrayal. They only regretted that the betrayal had frozen their assets. They were still treating me as their financial shield, expecting me to sacrifice my meager savings to save their pride. I reached into my leather purse for the final time. Thomas exhaled a long, visible sigh of relief. Assuming my conditioning had won, Martha wiped her eyes, her posture relaxing. Confident the crisis was averted, Kevin watched from the doorway, his eyes tracking my hand, perhaps wondering if there was enough money in my account to cover his legal fees, too. I did not withdraw my wallet. I pulled out a glossy, tri-fold paper brochure. I laid it flat on the wooden table, placing it directly over the embossed seal of the state exoneration letter. The cover of the brochure featured a simple graphic of a house with a glowing chimney. The bold letters across the top spelled out the Maine Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program in Downeast communities. Accepting government welfare carries a heavy, unspoken social stigma. Men like my father prided themselves on their rugged independence, looking down on neighbors who relied on food pantries or fuel vouchers to survive the harsh winters. By placing that specific pamphlet on his dining table, I was delivering a lethal blow to the very core of his identity. I was forcing him to acknowledge his new reality. He was no longer the prosperous coastal patriarch. He was a destitute senior citizen, relying on state aid to avoid freezing to death in his own living room. I tapped the printed phone number on the front of the brochure. I kept my voice even, refusing to let the bitter cold or the residual grief taint my delivery. I told them to call the state hotline for emergency fuel vouchers. I explained that the government provides expedited assistance for vulnerable seniors facing acute winter hazards. The operators would guide them through the lengthy application process, verify their frozen bank accounts, and eventually dispatch an oil truck to the property. Thomas stared at the pamphlet as if I had just placed a venomous snake on his table. His face flushed a deep, mottled red, the humiliation burning through his shivering frame. He opened his mouth to protest, to demand respect, to refuse the indignity of a government handout. I cut him off before he could speak. I told him the era of the small loans was permanently over. I laid out the grim mechanics of their situation with clinical precision. I explained that I could no longer serve as their financial shield. They had spent years laundering my Waitress tips to protect a son who repaid them by stealing their federal benefits. When the money ran out, they chose to protect the thief by attempting to hand me over to the authorities. They built a trap designed to steal my inheritance and destroy my freedom. Now, the trap had snapped shut on them. I informed them that they needed to navigate the brutal consequences of those choices on their own. I would not drain my savings to buy them a few days of artificial warmth. I refused to hand them my water to put out a fire they willfully ignited. I turned my back on the dining table. I walked across the cold linoleum, my footsteps sounding heavy and final in the quiet kitchen. I approached the mudroom door where Kevin stood. My brother stepped aside, pressing his back against the wooden frame, refusing to meet my gaze. He looked hollow, stripped of the arrogance that had defined his entire existence. I walked past him without offering a single word of comfort or condemnation. His impending legal ruin was a burden he would carry alone. I pushed the heavy front door open and stepped out onto the porch. The biting November wind whipped across the yard, carrying the salty scent of the churning Atlantic Ocean. The cold stung my cheeks, but the air felt remarkably clean. The heavy, suffocating pressure that had lived in my chest for 35 years vanished, carried away by the coastal gale. I walked down the wooden steps toward my rusted sedan, leaving the freezing farmhouse and its broken inhabitants behind me, ready to embrace a quiet, profound peace they could never touch. The brutal coastal winter eventually broke, yielding to the brief, vibrant thaw of a Maine summer. August arrived, bringing a flood of eager tourists in bright vehicles, pulling camper trailers down the winding stretches of Route 1. The gray, churning Atlantic transformed into a brilliant, sparkling blue, reflecting the clear, unclouded sky. The seasonal shift brought a renewed frantic life back to the local harbors and filled the diner with a relentless, energetic hum. 8 months had passed since I walked out of that freezing kitchen, leaving my family to face the cold wreckage of their own design. The legal dust kicked up by the state forensic audit finally settled over the county, leaving behind a radically altered landscape where every hidden truth had been dragged into the searing light. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding precision that ignores the pride of local men. When the district attorney presented the forged Social Security checks, the captured bank deposits, and the undeniable paper trail leading directly to his commercial accounts, Kevin found himself backed into an inescapable corner. His budget defense lawyer negotiated a desperate plea agreement to keep him out of a federal penitentiary. Kevin stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to a lesser felony charge of severe financial mismanagement and fraud. The court sentenced him to 5 years of strict probation, mandating heavy monthly restitution payments and random audits by a state parole officer. But the true punishment, the sentence that shattered his world, was professional. The state of Maine permanently revoked his commercial lobstering license. The revocation severed my brother from his identity. A man who defined his entire worth by the length of his boat and the size of his daily catch was legally banished from the helm. The bank auctioned off the Martha Jane to a younger captain from a neighboring town, erasing our family name from the local fleet. Kevin now spends his days working at a sprawling commercial processing plant on the industrial outskirts of the harbor. He stands on a wet concrete floor, wearing heavy rubber boots, sorting rotting herring and frozen bait into plastic buckets for minimum wage. The local fishermen, the same men who witnessed his humiliation in the diner, now pull their trucks up to the loading dock and hand Kevin their empty bait buckets. He has to look his former peers in the eye while performing the grueling, menial labor he once believed he was far too important to touch. The golden son was stripped of his crown, condemned to serve the industry he tried to cheat. Thomas and Martha remain confined to the ancestral farmhouse on the rocky bluff. The bitter winter froze the last remaining fragments of their curated social pride. Without my covert waitress tips subsidizing their lifestyle, and with their bank accounts drained by the legal fees they incurred, solidifying to defend Kevin, they were forced to embrace the stark reality of their fixed income. They live strictly on meager Social Security deposits and government aid. When the cold weather inevitably returns, they will have to swallow their lingering arrogance and dial the state hotline. The local oil distributor now requires them to present their low-income Home Energy Assistance Program vouchers before pumping a single drop of fuel into their rusted tank. They wear outdated clothes bought from local thrift stores, unable to afford the premium brands they once flaunted at the regional ice rinks. The isolation they weaponized against me became their permanent, suffocating reality. Small towns possess long, unforgiving memories. The local church congregation and the tight-knit hockey community learned about the forged federal checks and the resulting elder abuse investigation. The respectable Down East families quietly distanced themselves from the farmhouse. Sarah finalized a rapid divorce, securing full physical custody of the 3 boys, and moved out of state, ensuring my parents rarely see the grandchildren they prized above all else. Thomas and Martha sit on their drafty wooden porch, watching the tourist cars drive past, isolated in a quiet prison built entirely from their own deceit. But the most profound piece of poetic justice emerged from the rigid legal structure of the irrevocable Medicaid Asset Protection Trust. When Kevin initiated his fraudulent extortion scheme attempting to force me to sign the decanting waiver, he unwittingly triggered a fatal legal lock. Because the state documented an active case of financial exploitation involving the primary grantors, the probate court intervened with a heavy hand. To protect the underlying equity from being drained by my parents, to pay Kevin's criminal restitution, the judge issued a permanent binding ruling. The trust can never be decanted, dissolved, or altered under any circumstances. The complex legal maneuver my parents used to hide their wealth from the government morphed into an unbreakable concrete vault. The farmhouse is locked tight. My parents cannot borrow a single dime against the equity. Kevin cannot touch a fraction of the property value. The state ruled that the original terms must be honored in perpetuity. I remain the sole primary remainder beneficiary. By attempting to destroy my future and frame me for their crimes, they inadvertently guaranteed my long-term financial security. When Thomas and Martha eventually pass away, the deed to the highly coveted coastal property will transfer directly to me, clear of any liens or debts. I do not plan to live in a house tainted by that much betrayal and sorrow. The day the title clears, I will list the property on the commercial real estate market, sell it to the highest bidder, and use the substantial influx of capital to fund a quiet, beautiful retirement far away from the icy Maine coast. The trap they built to rob me became the impenetrable fortress guarding my inheritance. I did not need to wait for that future inheritance to find my daily peace. The summer tourist season hit Acadia National Park in full force, keeping my section at the diner packed from dawn until the streetlights flickered on. I finished a grueling, busy lunch shift, the soles of my taped work shoes aching in a familiar, comforting way that reminded me of my own resilience. The late afternoon sun flooded through the large front windows, casting a warm, golden glow across the red vinyl booths and the checkered linoleum floor. I wiped down the stainless steel counter with a damp cloth, enjoying the quiet, steady rhythm of honest labor. The brass bell chimed, and a traveler passing through on Route 1 sat at the corner stool looking weary from the road. I smiled, handed him a laminated menu, and served him a generous slice of warm blueberry pie made fresh that morning. The chaotic warfare of the past year felt like a distant, fading storm rolling out to sea. I walked over to the commercial brewer, poured myself a simple, steaming cup of black coffee, and pushed open the heavy wooden door leading to the rear of the restaurant. I stepped out onto the back deck, leaning my forearms against the sturdy wooden railing. The salty breeze brushed against my face, carrying the distinctive sound of crying seagulls and crashing waves. I looked out over the rugged Atlantic coastline, watching the bright white hulls of the lobster boats trace paths across the deep blue water. I did not receive a tearful family reconciliation. I never received a sincere apology for the stolen wages, the calculated perjury, or the years of neglect. The storybooks often promise that blood always finds a way to heal, but reality rarely offers such neat, painless resolutions. Instead of a fractured family, I gained something infinitely more valuable and enduring. I gained a profound, unshakable peace built on a firm boundary that no one would ever cross again.